distinguished members of Council of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, recognized Vice President Sir Woodville Marshall, invited guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Tennyson Joseph, and it is my distinct and distinguished honor to chair the first of the lectures of the 2012 lecture series hosted by the Barbados Museum and Historical Society in collaboration with the Department of History and Philosophy of the Faculty of Humanities of the Cayville campus of the University of the West Indies. I have been informed by the organizers that the lectures are intended to be very informal, and so we will go right into the proceedings. But in calling the meeting to order, I would simply like to issue a gentle reminder that we should turn off all cell phones or put them on silent or vibrate mode. That's my first task as chairman. My second task will be to invite Mr. Kevin Farmer, the Deputy Director of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, to offer welcome remarks and to tell us some more about the lecture series as a whole. Mr. Farmer.
Good night. Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Ladies and gentlemen, let me evoke a word of welcome, as would have been done among some people in 1937. Comrades, good night. Welcome to the 9th year and 10th lecture series put on by the Barbados Museum and Historical Society and the University of the West Indies Department of History and Philosophy. This year, in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the Labor Rebellion of 1937, our program stretches from February 14th to April 10th, in which we will seek to dissect, imbibe, and have a greater understanding of not only the causes, but effects and legacy of the rebellion of 1937. And might I also add a special thank you for those of you who came out tonight, and for those of you who will be following the lecture series until its final end. The series aims to provide Barbadians with valuable information and insight into aspects of Barbadian history and heritage, and dare I say, at the only place where you'll get it, and that is at the BMHS and UE's lecture series. I also want to point out why we chose this venue in the heart of Bridgetown, which is now a World Heritage Site. The Steel Shed was chosen, one, because of its ambience, the ease by which you can get here, and from which you can move away towards home. But more importantly, not too far away, literally a stone's throw away, we sit tonight from the place in which the Lemoyne Commission held its hearings into the effects and causes of that rebellion. And might I add, by the end of the series, perhaps we'll realize that we are still in fact living out some of the legacy of that rebellion, but I leave that for the lecturers to come to inform you about. That basically as my task, as the chair has already thanked the sponsors, and I especially wanted to thank you for coming out tonight, and I look forward to seeing you for the remainder of the lecture series. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Kevin. It is now my responsibility to introduce our featured speaker for tonight, Dr. George Belle. And in introducing him, it is appropriate that in keeping with the standards of democratic accountability and transparency, that I begin with a declaration of personal interest. The last time I heard Dr. George Belle deliver a public lecture, the year was 1992. The venue was right here at the Queen's Park Steel Shed. At the time, I was an undergraduate student at the Cave Hill campus pursuing a degree in history and political science. His lecture was entitled "The Collapse of the Soviet System, Implications for the Caribbean Left." When that lecture was delivered, the Caribbean was grappling with the formation of the single European economy. The Caribbean left was in disarray and in ideological confusion arising out of the collapse of Eastern European and Russian communism. And the Caribbean was coming to terms with the reversal of its independence project as a result of what was still a new reality, which we now call globalization. During that lecture, there were so many small gems springing from his agile and fertile mind and pouring out of his mouth that I can trace both my MPhil thesis and my PhD dissertation to an obscure line or passing thought that he uttered during the course of his talk. So it is for this reason that I was more than happy to accept the invitation to chair tonight's proceedings and to introduce Dr. George Belle. My agreement to do so was motivated by the purely selfish expectation that, as he had done 20 years ago, and as he has always done, that he would teach us something new, that he would introduce new thought and a new perspective, and that he would open the door to new directions from where we currently stand. Dr. George Belle is, in my view, the most accomplished living student of the political economy of Barbados. His study of the political economy of Barbados can be traced to his PhD thesis, completed at the University of Manchester in 1977, entitled "The Politics of Development, a Study in the Political Economy of Barbados." That study was an application of the Marxist theory of change to the political evolution of Barbados from a slave society to an independent state. That work did many things. First, it was a remarkable and well-researched political history of Barbados. Secondly, it was a supreme demonstration of how the Marxist method is applied. Thirdly, Dr. Belle's PhD, which has informed many other researchers and writers, brought to life the ideas and work of many Barbadian political actors who have since entered the realm of popular discourse, including Samuel Jackman Prescott, Clement Payne, Colonial Wickham, and many others. I sincerely believe that there is a book in waiting simply from the collection of the several articles and his ongoing research on Barbadian political actors and the politics of change. Having completed his PhD in 1977, Dr. Belle began a long and unbroken association with the University of the West Indies, teaching briefly at the Mona campus before returning to Cave Hill campus and his homeland Barbados, where he has been one of the main pillars in building the political science unit within the Faculty of the Social Sciences and in providing leadership to the Faculty of Social Sciences as a whole, where he currently serves as Dean. His time spent at the Cave Hill campus has seen him pursue his research and intellectual interests in political theory and political philosophy, the politics of development, and the political economy of Barbados and the Caribbean. Arising out of his research efforts have been a number of published articles. These include, though not exhaustively, The Struggle for Political Democracy, the 1937 Riots, published in an edited work by Woodville Marshall in 1988. The Collapse of the Soviet System, Implications for the Caribbean Left, published in an edited work by Alan Cobley in 1994. The Abortive Revolution of 1876 in Barbados, published in an edited work by Hilary Beckles and Vereen Shepard in 1993. And finally, a work entitled Samuel Jackman Prescott, published in an edited work by Glenford Howe and Don Marshall in 2001. He is currently working on publishing a series of book-length collections of his published and unpublished work and newspaper articles and public lectures gathered and delivered over the years. But Dr. Belle has never existed as a detached intellectual. From his earliest days as a trade union activist in the hotbed of Caribbean revolution in the 1970s Mona campus environment, to his formation of the Workers' Party of Barbados in the mid-1980s, Dr. Belle has always functioned as an organic intellectual in the sense outlined by Antonio Gramsci. In fact, much of his writing has been informed by his work as a revolutionary activist, from his fulminations against USA imperialism in the Anglophone Caribbean, published in a Caribbean Conference of Churches working paper in the 1980s, to his more recent analyses on globalization and recolonization. All have been informed by his involvement in concrete praxis. As public intellectual too, George Belle has not been only a past newspaper columnist and frequent commentator on current issues when called upon by the media, but he has also been in service to the government of Barbados as an advisor to the Prime Minister between 2003 and 2007 on governance and the CSME. The intellectual impact of George Belle on the country of his birth is therefore immeasurable. For those who have difficulty in judging one's worth in terms of intellectual work and published articles and books, I can suggest that we can measure George Belle in terms of the sons and daughters that he has spawned. In his later moments, he often jokes about the people that he has produced, giving trouble in the media, academia, and in government throughout the length and breadth of the Caribbean. They include Ernest Hilaire, Glenford Howe, Cynthia Barrow-Giles, Chris Sinclair, Don Marshall, Peter Wickham, Sanker Price, Kerry Simmons, Chantal Monroe-Knight, and Rodney Worrell, and that is just a very, very short list. So our speaker comes to us heavy with real experience, but mentally agile and intellectually nimble. And so we have come full circle. From 1992, when in the midst of the collapse of communism, he delivered here at the Steel Shed a lecture on the collapse of the Soviet system and its implications for the Caribbean left. Today, 20 years later in 2012, he is here again at the Steel Shed in the midst of the collapse of neoliberalism and in the midst of a new wave of global change to take us back to the beginning so we can move forward. It is my pleasure, therefore, to welcome to the podium Dr. George Belle, revolutionary scholar, Caribbean intellectual, and Dean of the Faculty of the Social Sciences, to speak on the topic Labor on the Move, Global Labor Organization and Protest in the 1920s and 1930s.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Tennyson, one of my best political theory students, for that great introduction. Kevin is another student as well, right there. Yeah, Professor Marshall and the representatives of the Museum and Historical Society, the Department of History and Philosophy from UWI, sponsors, all distinguished persons in the audience. Good evening again. I'll come back to some introductory remarks later, but this is the way I want to start by getting right into the substance with two quotations. In the contemplation of individual things, it forgets the connection between them. In the contemplation of their existence, it forgets the beginning and the end of that existence. Of their repose, it forgets their motion. it cannot see the wood for the trees. Frederick Engels' anti-daring. And the second one, these ideas, these categories are as little eternal as the relations they express. They are historical and transitory products. There is a continual movement of growth in productive forces, of destruction in social relations, of formation in ideas. The only immutable thing is the abstraction of movement. Mors immortalis, immortal death. Karl Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy. Now, those two quotations capture the theoretical theme that will run throughout tonight's lecture. I will wish you especially to note Marx's conclusion in the second quotation, Mors immortalis. In that is everything. I want to thank those who asked me to participate in this lecture tonight again, in this lecture series commemorating the 75th anniversary of the 1937 labor revolts in Barbados. 25 years ago, so 5 years before Tennyson was speaking about, I was also here in the steel shed. And I gave a public lecture then celebrating the 50th anniversary of the 1937 revolt, sponsored by the Department of History, UWI, and National Cultural Foundation. And the title of that lecture was The Struggle for Political Democracy, the 1937 Riots. It was very heated in here that night, because the crowd was about, I would say, probably 3 times as big as this. I was up there, and there were people backing out through the entrance right onto the pathway, and it was in the midst of very high talk, action, and debate in Barbados. And therefore, that whole series at that time really brought a lot of energy, and I certainly remembered it. I remember it, and I'm going to say, even though it was my lecture, that it was a classic lecture. I challenged the title of the lecture given to me then, not so much because I felt I should have been given a different title. I challenged it because in doing so, I was able to extend analysis of that event by allowing myself to analyze whether indeed the 1937 event was riot, rebellion, or revolution. It was being called different things by different sources at the time. I asserted and concluded that 1, it was not a mere riot, but 2, it was not sufficient to be a revolution, and 3, it was undisputably qualified to be a rebellion, an insurrection even. And I said much more, of course, than that. And all insurrections do not result in revolutions, nor do they necessarily go in the direction intended by the main or leading activists within them. I treated that topic that night in that way. I did that to analyze. I did that analysis to capture the essence of the social phenomenon that occurred in 1937. And tonight, I wish to challenge again the title given to me for this lecture, and again, not because I should have been given a different title, but because I again want to extend the analysis, labor on the move in the 1920s and 1930s. And I want to take the opportunity to excoriate the manifestations of the labor movement on the move in the 1920s and 30s by labor, so that we might expose ourselves to the essence of this labor movement, this struggle of the masses of producers in society. In my view, in this way, we get to a greater understanding of what was taking place at that time and the implications of the manifestations which took place then and their impact on us, or now, their impact on us at this present time. We are seeing a tendency today to make into icons these historical events, a tendency to reduce critical perspective and to sanitize our development processes. The danger of this is to mislead our current population and to mislead ourselves about our social realities. So again, my hope and intention is to increase critical discussion via the approach that I bring to the topic tonight. I know, for instance, that a number of issues about the 1930s and 1937 specifically in Barbados, which are today taken as common sense and taken for granted, were in 1973, when I was doing interviews here in Barbados for my master's thesis, that were then at that time taboo. I walked all around Barbados looking for people from the 1937 experience. The people from that period were ashamed of 1937. Many of them did not want to speak about it. They were led, in a sense, by the two mass parties that were dominant then and are dominant now in Barbados. The Barbados Labour Party did not want to speak about it because they felt it might reduce the role of Sir Grantley Adams by enhancing the presence of the Right Excellent Clement Osborne Payne. That picture of Payne that is paraded all over the place now did not come into the public space until 1987. I was one of two people who first saw that picture. Clement Payne, before that, had been made invisible. We didn't know what he looked like. We only used our imagination as to what he would look like. I was surprised when I saw what he looked like. I didn't realize he was such a striking person when I saw the picture of Clement Payne. The Democratic Labour Party did not want to speak about 1937 either, because they felt it would enhance the Right Excellent Sir Grantley Adams, and it would diminish the Right Excellent Errol Walton Barrow. So this meant, I repeat, that both of the dominant mass Democratic parties had vested interest in maintaining a silence about 1937. Even up to the 1970s, their silence there was. Somebody like Herbert Seal. A lot of people talk about Herbert Seal now because it's like, well, of course, Herbert Seal was one of the actors and activists coming out of the 1930s, building the Organization of Labor, the Progressive League, and so on. I saw Herbert Seal's name as a sentence in a book, in one of the books that F.A. Hoyes had published. And I wanted to know why this name was just in a sentence and then nothing else was said about him. And that encouraged me to go and search for Herbert Seal. And when I found Herbert Seal, by searching, a whole big story emerged. A lot of that now, I suspect, is also common sense. But it was secret when I saw that sentence and read that sentence at the time. Another caveat that I will raise in relation to making icons of the 1930s is with respect to why persons of African descent and East Indian descent, but particularly those of African descent, were so immersed in a political economy which was British imperial political economy. We were part of a British economic empire, just as today, in another crisis, we are part of an until recently unchallenged global capitalism in a neoliberal era that has lasted at least 25 years. If we were not so immersed in British imperial political economy, the persons of African descent in Barbados would not have been participants in a resistance in the 1930s that has come to be known as the 1930s labor rebellions. We would have been doing something else, somewhere else. The outstanding African political theoretician and leader of the revolution against Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau, leader of the PAIGC, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, who was brutally assassinated by the Portuguese fascists at the point of victory of the revolution in 1973, spoke to this dilemma for African people at home and abroad, subjected to European colonialism. Cabral said, "We therefore see that both in colonialism and in neocolonialism, the essential characteristic of imperialist domination remains the same: the negation of the historical process of the dominated people by means of violent usurpation of the freedom of development of the national productive forces." This observation, which identifies the essence of the two apparent forms of imperialist domination, seems to us to be of major importance for the thought and action of liberation movements, both in the course of struggle and after the winning of independence. On the basis of this, we can state that national liberation is the phenomenon in which a given socio-economic whole rejects the negation of its historical process. In other words, the national liberation of that people, in other words, the national liberation of a people is the regaining of the historical personality of that people its return to history through the destruction of the imperialist domination to which it was subjected. Its return to history. Its return to its history. So any colonial people, Cabral is saying, they're really dragged out of their history, and then they are put into somebody else's history. And in our case, we were immersed in the political economy of Europe. And that is why we were immersed in the great crisis of capitalism, in the Great Depression in the 1920s and the 1930s. Without that colonial reality, we would have been in a different social development. We would have been doing different things. 1930s would not have happened in the way that we are seeking to celebrate them now. That is why we have to be cautious about how we celebrate them. You need to understand them and not just turn them into a picture as if this is something that it was the greatest thing on earth. I will develop that perspective as I go along. Prior to that period, of course, there are movements of the masses of producers under colonialism in the British Caribbean through slavery and the resistance to slavery. Through the early emancipation years in the 19th century, under S.J. Prescott, for instance, Samuel Jackman Prescott in Barbados and its Colonial Union of the Colored People, but others throughout the Caribbean before emancipation and immediately after emancipation through the 19th century and into the early 20th century. These efforts carrying right through to the rise of organized labor in the metropolitan center of the empire itself. The rise of organized labor in the metropolitan center in the United Kingdom in the late 19th century. So the British working class and labor movement mature at the end of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th century, and give rise to institutional manifestations, the socialist clubs, the Fabian Socialists, the trade union movement, the Independent Labour Party, the Labour Party itself, taking its place as an electoral force in Britain with the expansion of the franchise. It is these developments in Britain which will reach out eventually to influence the working people in the British West Indies. And will be reflected in the multitudinous institutional, organizational, and ideological experimentations within the labor movement. So if you look at histories of the labor movement in that period and you read the details, you're going to see that a significant amount of things are going on. People in all kinds of little clubs, semi-trade unions, semi-political parties, all before the more impactful, well-known organizational forms appear. So they're experimenting, trying to see what will work and what can work and what will last and so on. And all of this is under the influence of what is coming down from the metropolitan center and, of course, the dynamics of their activity and existence in the political economy within the colonies itself. Some of the leaders influenced by these British socialist ideas during the period of the 1914, was during the period of the 1914-1918 World War. People like Cipriani in Trinidad, Norman Manley in Jamaica, Colonel Wickham in Barbados. Others like Dr. Charles Duncan O'Neill were impacted by the British labor movement at its very institutional genesis. This social democratic Second International Socialist movement is rivaled in the early British formations, but particularly out of Europe, by the parallel maturing of a revolutionary socialist alternative, the Communist First International and Third International. Karl Marx and Marxism challenged the reformist socialist manifestations in the movements of the producers. They challenged the philosophical, ideological, and organizational forms as errors. Errors in the labor movement. And like Mors Immortalis, I want to note errors in the labor movement as identified by rivals in the labor movement, one against the other, as a conceptual, analytical category. And we will be using this as we proceed again in the lecture. This challenge to the social democratic labor movement is deepened with the arrival in 1917 of the Russian Revolution. Marxism-Leninism is established by the success of the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin. In revolution against Tsarist Russia by the workers and peasants, the producer masses of Russia. This becomes an alternative influence on West Indians as demonstrated in Marxist agitational methods identified in the labor revolts of the 1930s under the influence of the international communist theoretician and organizer, the Trinidadian George Padmore, Marxist and Pan-Africanist. And the other brilliant Trinidad Marxist theoretician and organizer, C.L.R. James. Their philosophy, ideology, and agitational and organizational methods and forms are different from the Social Democrats and offer a severe critique against the Social Democrats as an expose of error in philosophy, error in ideology, error in agitation, error in organization. The initiation of the Chinese post-nationalist communist revolution under Mao Zedong is a further influence and inspiration to the producing masses. Just by quick illustration, not so much that George Padmore or C.L.R. James would be in the forefront of advocating and suggesting that the Leninist organization should be the form that should be taken in organizing the labor movement globally, because James had already developed a critique against what was arising in the Soviet Union, and Padmore, of course, was going to break away from his experiences in the Soviet Union, especially because of the relations of the Soviet Union in terms of Africa. But just to say quickly what would be the organizational contrast of a revolutionary leftist position versus a social democratic position. The Social Democratic Party, in its essential feature, is an omnibus party. It is a party that seeks to have alliances because it is essentially operated within a liberal democratic condition in which it wants to maximize support for electoral purposes. So it's an all-carrying party. The Revolutionary Party is a party that is seeking to focus maximum political force against whatever state apparatus is holding back the revolutionary forces and defeat them, and defeat that force. So instead of being omnibus, you will get better, fewer, but better. So the organizational form of Lenin is better, fewer, but better. A party of professional revolutionaries who can destroy the state apparatus of the ruling class. The organizational form of the Social Democrats is an omnibus organization to win as much alliances and organize and mobilize as far and broad alliances as possible in order to maximize victory in the electoral process. The revolutionary forces would have brought into being technology that were well used in the organizing of the labor force. A few weeks ago, might be months now, at a lecture in commemoration of Patrick Emmanuel, I gave the illustration of the technology of the newspaper in relation to the building of organization. Now you'll see a lot of newspapers developing in that early period, whether they were revolutionary newspapers or not. I'm coming on to Garvey next. Garvey had a very important and useful newspaper that allowed him to mobilize globally. But the revolutionary influence in Europe coming out, the left and the Leninists in particular influence, saw the newspaper as scaffolding for building party organization. So where the omnibus were searching to pull in all kinds of forces in alliance, and Lenin was saying better, fewer, but better, he was saying also that the scaffolding of the newspaper allowed him to be in contact with people all over the country and coming back to inform the revolutionaries at the center, people that were professional revolutionaries. They didn't do anything else but practice revolution. The paper was collective organizer. The paper was collective propagandist. The paper was collective agitator. So collective propagandist, collective agitator, collective organizer, and the scaffolding of political organization. And I said to the people then that since we are going into another insurrectionary era, because of the crisis in neoliberalism, the crisis in the system that has dominated the globe, as I said before, for about 25 years now, pushing the progressive forces back. I'm using progressive in an ideological way. That is coming to an end on the basis of the crisis within capitalism itself and what that lets loose in certain areas across the globe, notably in North Africa, in the Arab uprising. And when we look there and we see the technology of today, we see that the technology of today is the BlackBerry. The BlackBerry is collective propagandist. The BlackBerry is collective agitator. The BlackBerry is collective organizer. That is the spiral that we're going to be talking about. That is the way in which things keep changing and carrying forward a process that is always under there. What Heraclitus said was a river, a flowing river that keeps going. And we just have these manifestations on top of it. So I've started to talk about some of these manifestations. A trade union here, a political party there, the Revolutionary Party here, a Reformist Party there, experimentation here, experimentation there. And the labor movement keeps going on and on, Old Man River. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by the Jamaican Marcus Mosiah Garvey, is of Pan-Africanist mode, even though not a part of the Pan-Africanist fraternity as dominated by W.E.B. Du Bois and George Padmore and C.L.R. James. Indeed, all three of these identify Garvey's black nationalism as ultra-nationalism and pro-capitalist, fascist even, and do not come to terms with Garvey's contribution until well after his death, when they embrace him into the Pan-Africanist fold. Instead, at that time, Garveyism, seeking like Cabral, Amilcar Cabral that we pointed to earlier, Garveyism was seeking to tell Africans at home and abroad to come out of the European hegemony, come out of European political economy. Garvey's requests for people to, at home and abroad, the Africans at home and abroad, to come out of the hegemony of Europe was seen as unrealistic and an error. His vision of a Pan-African state is seen as illusionary, as a means of liberating the black masses in the 1920s and 1930s. His connection with Africa's antiquity as a powerful, inspirational, and ideological tool is seen as underdeveloped, and did have features of underdevelopment, which 20 or 30 plus years later would be upgraded by the brilliance of the Senegalese scholar of Egyptian antiquities, Cheikh Anta Diop. But Garvey provides for the grassroots leaders of the labor movement throughout the British West Indies training in leadership, training in organization, training in agitation, training in propaganda. His newspaper, The Negro World, is an international organizer. He gives to the grassroots activists political experiences which they never would have had were it not for the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Many of the Garveyites ended up with charges of sedition against them. In Barbados, for instance, Israel Lovell, Ulrich Grant, and the like, and left the way open for leadership of the labor movement by middle-class politicians of a liberal and social democratic bent, or bourgeoisified working-class leaders. It is the latter, with some qualification, such as the Byrds, the Bradshaws, much later, Garys, and perhaps, in part, Sir Alexander Bustamante with both his upper and other class origins, who lead the institutional forms that developed out of the 1930s labor resistance. Grantley Adams, Norman Manley are typical examples of the Oxbridge middle-class political labor leader prototype. There is, in the case of Jamaica, another African-centered influence that came post in a rise East Starvelings describes as an Ethiopianism. This Ethiopianism produces the Rastafari movement. The Rastafari movement that identifies with Haile Selassie and his coronation in 1930, the imperial emperor of Ethiopia. The Ethiopianism identifies also with the harassment and overthrow of His Imperial Majesty in 1935 by the fascist Mussolini in the throes of the effects of the Great Depression. If you read the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey, you will see the hostility that Garvey felt initially against Mussolini. He called him the fat Italian hog. That itself tells you something about Garvey too, because when we look at the opinions, at one time he supports the Soviet Union, and yet he's attacking fascism, but he's accused by black leftists at the time of being fascist. And therefore it shows that there were influences on Garvey, both from the social democratic and from ultra-nationalists that were present in the one person. Something that C.R.R. James later will, referring to Hegel, call contradiction, a necessary contradiction in people. And it's not necessarily anything that you should be dismissive of them because of that. That it is a part of life to carry these contradictions. But it's a part of the complexity too of Garvey. But he had this evidence of both positions, so you have to say, we understand then why George Padmore and C.L.R. James can ultimately recognize him as a progressive force in the period when they themselves were suspicious of him. Of course, he had other problems with the American left as well, because of his competition with them in the organization of the working class in the United States, especially the black working class. Neither Garvey or the Rastafarians are accepted by middle-class Jamaica. They see error in that path. But the Rastafarians, as much as they just want to get out of Jamaica and go back to Africa, they call the colonial system Babylon, and they wish to escape its hegemony by repatriation to Africa. In all of the manifestations of the labor in the labor movement, its results, we see one against the other, the accusations of error on the one against the other. And this is a part of the democratic culture that is growing against the gross resistance by the British political systems in place at the time, the Crown Colony government, and the old representative system. So we have, in the 30s and 20s as well, they didn't come into being then, they have a history long before that, but since we are told to talk about this period, and what the labor movement is up against, we look at that side of the contradiction as well. They're up against two fierce political systems, colonial political systems, described as Crown Colony government and the old representative system. So these are the forms of government, colonial government in the 1920s and 1930s. Crown Colony government is direct rule from the metropole in simple terms. Governor and executive council or governor and legislative council. Sometimes in the qualification of it, a few elected members and so on. But essentially, it is ruled by the governor directly from the British Imperial Center. The old representative system is a bit of a concession to the local interests with an oligarchic form of government, that is to say a limited democracy. And the governor is more or less like the head of the cabinet, if you can call it that, in relation to, let's say in Barbados after 1881, we had something called Governing Executive Committee because of the compromise that was made after the 1876 rebellion. In Jamaica, 1865, Jamaica went the other way. They went from the old representative system into Crown Colony government. Barbados retained the old representative system. The point is that in both cases, these are the political systems that the labor movement in the 20s, burgeoning labor movement, is up against. When, back in 1973, while doing that research for my master's, when I suggested to a later to become prominent politician in Barbados that I would wish to speak to some of the political activists from the period, I was told it would perhaps be a waste of time because most or all of them were senile. I don't see the person in here right now. but otherwise I think he would remember that conversation in the balcony of his house. Well, I still went searching for the senile people, and I found one that was blind but not senile, Mr. Roland Edwards, who wrote the music to our national anthem, Vincent Peter. In an old house, two-story house. He was downstairs, blind, couldn't get upstairs very easily. After speaking to Mr. Edwards for about 20 minutes, Mr. Edwards said, "You like you was a communist." My interest in Mr. Edwards, however, was what he had said before the Dean Commission and the Moyne Commission, which had inquired into the causes of the 1937 revolt in Barbados and the 1930s revolts throughout the British West Indies in the case of the latter, in the case of the Moyne Commission. Mr. Edwards had said, "Let the governor govern." This was in reference to his preferred form of governance instead of the old representative system. I had seen this before in Barbados in the 1876 revolt, where the St. Philip insurrectionists had declared that they were about Governor John Pope Hennessy's business in relation to justification for their revolt. And this was also a way of indicating their preference of government, because they were rejecting oligarchical government, planter government, the old representative system as well. Precisely the same form of government Roland Edwards was rejecting in 1937. Roland Edwards spoke on behalf of the laboring masses, the producers, as did the rebels of 1876. They all rejected planter oligarchy. It is interesting that recently we were asked to identify the 1652 action of the monarchists in Barbados with the founding of democracy in Barbados. This was an example of the sanitizing of Barbadian development. I'm not saying that you can't see that as an important historical heritage, something to preserve in the sense of saying this happened in Barbados and it's something for us to remember as a part of our history. But when you make the ideological extension and start to say that it is a part of some democratic process, then we start to engage in sanitizing development. In 1977, for my PhD thesis, I wrote in relation to planter oligarchy as follows. The laboring class, on the other hand, knew and understood oligarchy to be despotism. They knew and understood through their own experience that planter oligarchy and democracy were to each other as are the like poles of a magnet. They repel each other. So as young as I was then, I rejected the old representative system, the oligarchy. I stood with Roland Edwards and with the insurrectionists of 1876 in understanding the realities of Barbadian politics and what the oligarchy stood for. The political progression of planter oligarchy in Barbados was not democracy, it was racist government. As in Rhodesia. Rhodesia is the name that was the old colonial name in East Africa. And apartheid, as in South Africa. That was the ideological mentality of the oligarchs. It was a distortion of the liberal revolutionary position of John Locke that resided participation in democracy in the property owners. Because while that was oligarchic in the context of Britain as well, in the context of a colonial Caribbean with racial relations, it was racist in the colonies, racist in the empire, racist in Barbados. And that is why the working people, the producers, in 1876 and 1937, chose direct rule from England over oligarchy. Now, the story was different in Trinidad and Jamaica, who experienced Crown Colony government, because in their case, they felt that they had been deprived of the limited democratic experience. So that if you read people like Eric Williams, you'll see that he is very sympathetic to the experiences of democracy that places like Barbados went through, even in the oligarchic form. But when you hear Barbadians dealing with that form of government in the 30s, that is the government that they wanted to overthrow. And therefore, while the colonial presence might have confused the target, a truth was there emerging in the removal of undemocratic governance. The confusion was there because ultimately, in situations of great challenge, the British imperial power would have intervened and put down any resistance to their colonial reality. But those forms of governance were an era of governance over black populations that had been enslaved under colonialism, and the intensity of the colonial government's resistance to freedom was met with an equal resistance, as Frantz Fanon would say. And out of that, we will see soon that a greater truth arises, where C.L.R. James is going to say that we needed that confrontation, we needed that contradiction in order that we would know what was the character of the era. Interestingly, by point of illustration, George Lamin, in the Season of Adventure, through the character Powell, says the following: change my arse. Is independence what it is? One day in July you say you want to be that their thing, and one day in the next July the law say, all right, from now you is what was asking for. What change that can change? Might as well call your dog a cat and hope to hear him mew. It's only words and names, what don't signify nothing. And then it goes on, Powell. Free is how you is from the start. And when it look different, you got to move. Just move. And when you're moving, say that is a natural freedom, make you move. It is that feeling for freedom that make you move. It's like the Lockean position again that says freedom from domination by any other. And if you feel that domination coming upon you, you must throw it off. And that is a kind of fundamental engine of struggle. The struggle for freedom. We're seeing it in North Africa now again. It transcends all ideological positions. If you don't feel free, you move. We laborers in the 1920s and 1930s, they didn't feel free, so they moved. So then we call it a labor movement. Free is how you is from the start. And when it looked different, you got to move, just move. And when you move and say there's a natural feeling of freedom that make you move. And in that growth of the struggle for democratic transition, the political culture being created facilitates critiques, one upon the other, by the manifestations and variegations of the labor movement. Butler against Cipriani and his Trinidad Working Men's Association. Bustamante and his Bustamante Trade Union and JLP versus Norman Manley's People's National Party and at first Trade Union Congress and later the National Workers Union. Grant Lee Adams and the Progressive League and the Barbados Labour Party and the Barbados Workers Union, severely critiqued by Winter Crawford and his West Indian Congress Party and his Observer newspaper. Political unionism and party union coalition following the political unionism of Great Britain, that eventual powerful model of the British Labour Party and the Transport and General Workers Union. But for the colonial British political unionism as a form of organization for the West Indies labor movement is dangerous. For the colonies, the British consider that political unionism as a form of organization for the West Indies labor movement is dangerous. Party and union must be separated. And this is rejected, of course, by the maverick Bustamante and his Jamaica Labour Party, Bustamante Industrial Trade Union Coalition. We know what kind of maverick Bustamante was on the dance floor at the Independence Party in Jamaica when he had Princess Margaret in his arms. He asked Princess Margaret, "How your sister?" So it's not surprising that many years earlier, when the British went and told him, take the Buster out of Bustamante Industrial Trade Union, he said, staying right there. Because for me, political unionism is very important. But it is accepted by the Oxford-educated Grant Lee Adams in Barbados, who separates the Barbados Workers Union from the Barbados Labour Party. And I'm not saying which one is right or which one is good. That is not the nature of the exercise here tonight. I am showing how one or the other says that is error. You make an error in the organization of the labor movement. So the error is the issue that we are concerned about. That people are looking at these things and saying, it's error. One is saying it's error. One is saying, I want to do it this way. And I know that that illustration is beyond the 1920s and the 1930s, but they are connected to the formations of resistance in that period. Remember what Engels said at the beginning of the lecture. In the contemplation of individual things, it forgets the connection between them. In the contemplation of individual things, it forgets the connection between them. So when I am looking at the 1920s and 1930s, I will not forget the connection that continues right into our time. I will concentrate, as I was told to, in relation to the main emphasis of the illustration, but do not forget the connection between them. We have the social democratic parties and mass democratic parties that emerge out of the experimentations of the 1920s and 1930s. The social democratic and mass democratic parties are given a yes. The Leninist party is given a no, and we dealt with that before. Even though Eric Williams builds a social democratic party in Trinidad in terms of the model, the structure, but model on the People's National Party of Jamaica, but rejects the PNP socialism. Well, at least he says he's doing his own thing because he's Eric Williams. So Eric Williams cannot borrow from anybody. So he could not be practicing socialism, even social democracy, but he borrowed the organizational form of Norman Manley. And in Guyana, again, remember the connection, so I can go all to Cheddy Jagan, though he's back in the 40s, adopts a social democratic, mass democratic model, but it is led by Marxist-Leninists. So you have a social democratic party, but the leadership is Marxist-Leninist. Marx said, these ideas, these categories are as little eternal as the relations they express. So there are important reasons why the different forms are experimented with and taken on board, and others are rejected. The conditions that exist. There would have been no conditions present that would have accommodated with the presence of British imperialism a revolutionary party, for instance, in the 1930s in the West Indies. Even in the 1950s, when there was a suspicion that the PPP in Guyana was communist, the constitution was suspended in 1953 by the British. I wish to turn now to clearing up the treatment of the matter of this letter, or by reaching explicitly into Hegelian logic that informs it. And strainer this through the brilliance of C.L.R. James in his notes on dialectics. I remember we are trying to excoriate the manifestations and variegations and the experimentations that are all a part and riding on the labor movement, Heraclitus' river. And Hegel says, the German philosopher, the following: becoming in essence is reflective movement. It's hence the movement from nothing to nothing, and through nothing back to itself. The transition or becoming transcends itself in its transition. That other which arises in the course of this transition is not the not being of a being, but the nothing of a nothing, which constitutes being. Being exists only as the movement of nothing to nothing, and thus is essence. And essence does not contain this movement in itself, but is this movement, an absolute show and pure negativity, which has nothing without it that could negate it, but negates only its own negativity, which is only in this negation. You had to laugh, but that is the brilliant Hegel, brilliant dialectician. So C.L.R. James now, in West Indian language, seeks to explain that. So he says the following: imagine a spirit, a genie, Ariel, a disembodied being, flitting around in the spiritual void. He does not know who he is or what he is, but he wants to find out. And he has been told that inside his spiritual constellation are a number of elements which periodically explode into an object, a stone, a flower, a horse, an ape, a man, etc. He gets a chance in these to see what he really is, but he will know whether this is the real thing or not. If after a while he feels that this is not the real thing, he dissolves it, and he steps back again into a pure spirit. His only way of knowing anything about himself is to become one of the things that is in him. The day he becomes something and knows, feels that this is it, then he is something new at last. He has, we may say, a notion of his true self at last, but except as something that has become something for a while, he himself is a pure spirit, abstract, waiting in those cold regions. The essence is the fact that something continually becomes something else and negates it because it isn't what the thing that is becoming wants to be. So you just have to bring all that philosophy and theory down and see that that is what is going on with all the experimentation and the trade union this and the trade union that and the party this and the party that and the criticism of each other and so on and so forth. And the river keeps rolling on. So this is what we have sought to do in this lecture, to bring a progressive critique to the commemoration of our labor protests. What has really been going on in the movement? What is really about us? Now, I want you to recognize that while we're speaking here of a negation, and I'm going to say that in fact, what happens is that all of these forms, these variations are going to be negated. We're talking about dialectical negation. So I can say, Sir Alexander Bustamante, negated. Captain Cipriani, negated. Dr. Duncan O'Neill, negated. Colonel Wickham, Clement Payne, Norman Manley, Marcus Garvey, BITU, NWU, TUC, ALP, AWU, BLP, Barbados Progressive League, Barbados Workers Union, UNIA, George Padmore, Party Union Coalition, Political Unionism, PMP, GLP, DLP, PNM, PPP, GULP, New Jewel Movement, Workers' Party of Barbados, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, all of them negated, but it's dialectical negation. And in the dialectical negation, in that movement from nothing to nothing, there's stored up being. So that is why some other times you describe this progression as a spiral. Because a dialectical negation does not just destroy, it does do some destruction, but it also preserves the experience so that it can remember what it was that it did not want to be, and so on. And therefore you have stored up being. So it is not that we should not then study these things, because I say that they will be negated. We study them, but we should not make them into icons. We should not sanitize them, because then we will not learn the true lesson. So we will really, that little Ariel will be very confused. So, and we take it as a natural. What we have then is a producer struggling to live better and in peace. As Cabral would say, a process, a movement of effort to live better and in peace. As he says, Amilcar Cabral again, the people are not fighting for ideas, for the things in anyone's head. They are fighting to win material benefits, to live better and in peace, to see their lives go forward, to guarantee the future of their children. And from here, again, we can reflect on the number of the errors that manifest labor on the move, global labor organization and protests in the 1920s and 30s. By the 1920s, the USSR had been established, the successful workers' revolution, quote unquote, that had occurred in Russia. It was to carry all of the warts of Russia's historical experience onto the czars with it, but it was a quote unquote triumph for Marxist revolutionary theory, a triumph for peasants and workers, and this message went out over the globe and definitely impacted on the Caribbean. The Chinese Revolution was initiated, had the effect of freeing, strengthening millions of Chinese peasants, was news across the globe. But today, the Chinese Revolution, practicing the most intense form of capitalism, governed by the Communist Party of China, trying, experimenting, doing the thing, trying to see what is the best form of organization. Communists at top, capitalists below. Negating itself. But we learn from that experience. As James would say, we learned from the experience. In fact, the whole notes on dialectics are about trying to learn about the experience of the failed Soviet Union. The mass Democratic Party is struggling with reformism up to today, trying to say they want to do transition, going to elections every 5 years, frustrating people, and so on and so forth. All of them. So that we come to the issues of error and how you learn from them. And James says, thus it is not a blemish, a fault, a deficiency in a thing, if a contradiction is to be found in it. That is its life. So that is to put everybody at ease. This is not a blemish, a fault, a deficiency in a thing, if a contradiction is to be found in it. That is its life. But Hegel says, on the contrary, every determination, every concrete, every concept is essentially a union of distinguished and distinguishable moments which pass over through determinate and essential differences into contradictory moments. As usual, James says that in other words. But he sources his understanding of dialectical logic on Hegel. And then Hegel says further, or James says further, if there's no contradiction, then no movement, then there's no movement to speak of. And there's stagnation, a compromise. That is the only reason why there's compromise and stagnation, because the contradiction is not sharp enough. So he is glorying in the contradictions. Doesn't have a problem with it, saying, let them come forth, because that is how we're going to work it out. And Hegel, in his language, says the same thing. In the course of its process, the idea creates the illusion, that illusion, by setting an antithesis to confront it. And its action consists in getting rid of the illusion which it has created. Only out of this error does the truth arise. In this fact lies the reconciliation with error and with finitude. Error, or other being, when superseded, is still a necessary dynamic element of truth. Error, or other being, when superseded, is still a necessary dynamic element of truth. For truth can only be where it makes its own result, itself its own result. For truth can only be where it makes itself its own result. And that is seen as one of the most profound comments by Hegel, that the truth can only be where it makes itself its own result. So what has this all been about? As I suggested earlier, all about freedom. The labor movement, the protests, what were they all about? James says it is all about free creative activity as necessity. And free creative activity can only come into existence when it is faced with something that only free activity and free activity alone can overcome. You had to be faced with colonial government. You had to be faced with old representative system. You had to be faced with racism. Free creative activity can only come into existence when it is faced with something that only free activity and free activity alone can overcome. The regimes in North Africa. Free creative activity can only come into existence when it is faced with something that only free activity and free activity alone can overcome. That is the confrontation and contradiction of the 1920s and 1930s. And so we can go back to Lamin, to Powell. Free is how you is from the start. And when it look different, you got to move, just move. And when you move and say that it's a natural freedom, make you move. Mors immortalis. Thank you. See the pen? See the pen there? Yeah? Oh, okay.
Okay, I will not pretend to stand between Dr. Belle and his audience, so I will move directly to questions from the floor. I think Dr. Belle will take them as they come.
Tennyson, you pick up this one. No questions? Okay.
Good night, Dr. Bell. Thank you for a most intriguing and thought-provoking lecture. I guess my question will seek to remember what you taught me. And it goes like this. What does he who knows freedom know freedom? In relation to the rebellion of 37 and how we seek to deal with its legacy today.
Repeat it again, repeat it.
What does he who knows freedom know freedom?
What does he who knows freedom know freedom?
Know of freedom.
Know of freedom. Well, my thing on that is that you're always learning what it is to be free. So if you go back to Lamin, what Lamin is saying is that when you don't feel free, you move. That's all you do, just move. Because something holding you back. And that can be in all kinds of ways. It could be that somebody trying to starve you, that somebody fire you from your job, that the wrong government in place. Anything that make you feel that you ain't free, you just move and say it's a natural feeling that make you move. And if you keep that inside of you, you're never trapped by ideology or anything. That is your engine to keep you going. That is what keeps me going. So I came here 25 years ago, and I came here now and went through all of that anti-progressive years of neoliberal domination. And what I would have done in a situation like that is to make sure that I defended myself from anybody who was going to take away my freedom. It is something that I often say that if I were, you know the thing, I'll be a free man or rather than a slave, a free man in my grave. And you see when Marx says mors immortalis, then you understand why the slaves will say we will be free men in our grave. So it's a kind of continuous fuel for resistance to tyranny. Yes.
You make a distinction. I really enjoyed the lecture. It got a lot of ideas churning around in my head. You make a distinction between, you just made a distinction between ideology and freedom. And I'm wondering, I mean, all that we've been hearing about ideology, perhaps we were hearing it from the wrong people, suggested that ideology is a thing that helped you to be free. Or ideology is the terms in which you couched your freedom. But you make a distinction between ideology and freedom. Could you explain
it depends on who
bit?
taught you about ideology, because there are two classic definitions of ideology. One of them is where you say that ideology is really the kind of thinking of an age, you know, in a big way. And therefore, in a sense, it is manifesting conformism and all of that in that particular context. And another view is that ideology is falsification of reality, okay? And it is used as an instrument of control, so that there's nothing about freedom there at all. But what I would say to you is that in political battle and conflict, you will notice that when I was talking about how the labor movement organized itself, that they're told, campaign here did a little shift with it, but they're told organize, agitate, propagandize. Okay, propaganda, not very often a lot of propaganda is lies. It's to get so-and-so to get to do so-and-so. And the politicians, the political activists are manipulating realities in order to get certain objectives carried out. That is a form of ideology then, when they do that. And that is not necessarily about freedom at all. You have to look at what is the agenda behind and what is the motivation behind those people. And very often ideology is used for controlling people, not freeing them. Yes.
Right, thanks for a good philosophical lecture. My purpose is to try and push you a little further. You said we should be cautious about celebrating things. And my own view is that as the crisis deepens in Europe, these islands in the archipelago are going to feel the pinch a lot more. And I was just wanting to know if we are free, what are we free from? If we're independent, what are we independent of? And should we be moving, as you said, or as Lamin said? And if we move, where should we go next?
I think I said the how, the question of it is the how you do it. But in other words, not that you don't commemorate, it's how you commemorate. That I don't think you should commemorate things and turn them into icons. Because let's say I was in a conversation with somebody about Errol Barrow, and they said, they call him Sir Errol Walton Barrow. And I said, because I'd heard Errol Barrow many times speak, seen his body language and so on and so forth, I knew that Errol Barrow was one of those nationalists that rejected knighthood, so that he would never have accepted a British knighthood. He, Norman Manley, or Ed Williams would never take knighthood, so that, but the person would have been saying it that a person of that standing in that time, that unite them, as unite people now. So he is Sir Errol Walton Barrow. But Errol Barrow would not at all accept that. But the image of Errol Barrow that is coming down increasingly is an icon, is this sanitized view. So that, of course, he would do everything that is respectable. But I heard Errol Barrow on platforms do a lot of irrespectable things, like saying that he would carry people out in a Moses and sink them and all kind of thing, you know? So that, so that is because I actually saw him. I actually saw him on the platform. I actually heard him. But somebody 25 years from now, they see the pictures that we have up on a wall and Barrow looking very nice and pleasant and so on. They don't see him angry. They don't see him quarreling in Parliament or anything like that. And they don't hear all the nuances in his speech when he's delivering a point. Now, you're saying where to go from here? There are periods of time that you live in flux, and you have to be humble. So another feature of generations is that some generations are in a hurry, partly because they actually feel that they know everything. When you get enough, you live long enough to reflect, you know how gradually things go forward. And you see all types of people doing all types of things. And you know that you might live through a very long time where in the sense of something dramatic and fundamental, nothing happens. Like, again, I can use North African example. There are people there that they will spend the whole life under tyrants, and they don't know anything else. So they were born into tyranny, and they died in tyranny. And they would never have imagined that, what they call it, is spring uprising or what? Yeah,
Arab Spring.
Arab Spring, that would have happened. So, but the people that are seeing it now know that it is a reality. And they are saying what we want to do is we want to leave that and we want to go there. Now, depending on when you are living also, will depend on how crystallized are the formations and the programs put before you. One of the things about the 1920s and 1930s is that a lot of the programs were crystallizing. So you had people, particularly in the socialist movement. So you had that coming out of Europe in the 19th century, a whole set of people that were saying, we can change the world, and we can change the world by doing this. Now, post the whole 20th century experience shows us a whole set of frustrations, errors, and we have to work it out all again. So we now have to start to fuse. My view is that part of what I'm doing here is helping to fuse and to see what the alternative might be, how you might go forward. I don't think we are there yet. So that the answer to your question is that we are in the throes. We are still trying to work out where to go. And in a sense, I'll be very suspicious of anybody that comes now and says, follow me.
I love that. Yes. Thank you very much. Good night. Yeah? Right. Thank you, Dr. Belle, for, as usual, an erudite and provocative lecture. Just a couple of points before I get into what I'm saying. One about Clement Payne. I don't want to steal your thunder, but a number of us knew about Clement Payne. I happen to be married to the daughter of a man called Frank Ezra Clifford Hines, who was the librarian at the Advocate newspaper for 46 years. And it was he who, in 1962, fought what was then current wisdom in writing an article about the 1937 riots, as that 1962 marked the 25th anniversary. And while in his house courting his daughter, while he was still at university, I saw the picture of Clement Payne. It was brought to him by Howard Payne, Clement's brother. Just a point. Right. Another point is that it's a good thing that we are here in this refurbished, redesigned steel shed. Garvey spoke here, as you well know. And opposite this part is a man whose ideological comments I thought you would have dealt with tonight. Christopher Brathwaite, Chrissy Brathwaite, after whom I hope the steel shed will be named, because it was he who, in an eleemosynary spirit, that is humanitarian, utilized this space to help feed the people, the poor people of the parish, and then Rugged Motley took over and made it a point of clientelism. Chrissy Brathwaite, part of the Democratic League. Now tonight you dealt with, perhaps, I was trying to follow you, global influence on Caribbean ideological theories in the 20s and 30s. I didn't hear much about race. And if the 30s were a launch pad for those explosions of if the 20s, sorry, were a launch pad for the explosions of the 30s, I should have heard more about Garveyism. Garveyism is not informed by Hegelianism. You said he was a bit considered. Well, I'm not saying that you said so, but he's considered a fascist. But I thought you would have explicated more Garvey. Robert Love, Clennell Wickham, Mary Shaw, even Manley, Rienzi, Butler, O'Neill, Critchlow, all of them had discrete and idiosyncratic ideological views which were contrary to the Hegelian dialectic. They were struggling to make ideology as Caribbean as the coconut palm tree, and I'm not hearing you saying that tonight. So there's a Caribbean idiosyncrasy in the 1920s, and those of us who studied Duncan O'Neill's Democratic League, you notice that there is an ideological substratum, a podium, a pillar on which he builds his very practical, his praxis of help for the people of the area. But, excellent lecture, just a few areas here. Okay. Race, I'm not seeing race, and I'm not seeing the theories of a number of people who would have conquered Hegel.
I got you, Trevor, I got you, on the picture though, I'm just telling you when I saw the picture, and I'm just saying that at the time the picture that I'm talking about is the one that is in the paper every day, and so on. And I'm just saying that I know that in 1973, and in that period, that people did not know what pain looked like. That's all I'm saying. Again, on the Hegelian point, I'm not trying to make any case for Hegel. As I told you just now, anybody that got up and said that you should follow them, then I would be suspicious. Because I wasn't telling you to follow Hegel. I wasn't telling you to follow Marx. I wasn't telling you to follow anybody. And I'm not following any of them. The only body I'm following is me. And if you follow the logic of what I was saying, you would realize that that's what I was saying. I was saying that all the Hegelian thing is for me is a tool. That's all it was. It was a tool to excoriate. It wasn't anything to say that Hegel was influencing anybody. I was using Hegel as an analytical tool. Remember that you are a historian, I'm a political scientist. So we don't operate the same way. That is also why you want me to tell all the stories. Well, I also know I gotta go home tonight. But in any event, that is not how political scientists operate. I was showing you how tools are used to get clarity and get to truth, quote unquote. okay, and so on. So I think that you misunderstood me. I hope you did not misunderstand the entire lecture, Trevor.
We'll take two more questions, Dr. David Murray, and then the lady, I think you can walk to the microphone to speed up the process.
Thank you very much, Dr. Belle, for an intriguing theoretical discourse. I wanted to ask two questions. It would seem to me that there are at least two rivers. I know your lecture was about one river, which is the labor movement. But it would seem to me that the same process that you explained for that, that movement or that particular force, which was a force of the oppressed, there should exist at least a parallel movement or parallel river for the forces of the oppressors. So my question would be, if the experimentations and the manifestations were as varied and had a similar rhythm to the labor movement. That's the first question. The second question is about the dialectic and whether the period we're in now could be analyzed by the dialectic, because essentially you're saying it's chaotic. And there is a philosophical position that would suggest that by the time you reach the dialectic, the two seemingly contradictory positions have already reached some agreement. And that essential agreement is to get together to exclude chaos or the creativity. Yeah. So what would be your thinking on that?
Right, that first part of your question goes back again to Trevor as well. The issue of race is covered in the extent to which I dealt with Garvey. Remember I said I was bringing a critical perspective on it. So we can all tell the story on Garvey. We've all read it before and so on. So bringing a critical perspective on that. But from colony government, when I went into that and the old representative system, that is just institutionalized racism. So you're talking race all the time that you're going with those things. When you describe the colonial government, you're describing racism. Okay, so likewise here, those are the varied forms. But again, that was not my emphasis. I want to say, yes, you have varied forms, and let us treat them in a particular way. So I just given illustrations that, you can recognize that, you can recognize that, but try to understand what's going on under here. And of course, it happens both at the level of the oppressor and the oppressed. So you have slavery, and you have an old representative system. You have post-emancipation, and you have crown colony government, and so on. And it goes all the way through. So you always have just one reflecting the other. But the dialectic, is really a tool again. You don't have to use it. Some people use it spontaneously. I was just showing all the theoretical and philosophical foundations of it, and so on. But it is just something that has come over time, developed from antiquity. The Egyptians, a lot of Egyptian philosophers were dialecticians. It is observing nature, observing cosmology really, seeing how nature works, seeing how you work, seeing how you are put together. And on the basis of that, saying if this is how this thing holds together, then this is a way of a tool that you could use to understand things and to understand the essence. Look at the issue of the essence. A lot of people criticize things like in essence in terms of saying that you're an essentialist or something like that. But when you're a dialectician and talking about essence, you're talking about motion all the time. You're talking about anything that's fixed and mechanical. So it is really a methodology that has developed from deep and long observation and passed down through humanity. And then you choose whether you want to use it to try to explain your environment. It is not conditioned by any ideological presence. It is to do like if I say, what is the best chisel that I can use? What's the best hammer that I can use? And I choose dialectic. That's all. You're not preaching anything. I'm not trying to convert anybody. Matter of fact, it's very useful for me to keep it private. Because then I have advantage. Because you don't understand what you're doing at all. And you don't understand what I understand. So therefore, I really ain't got no reason to tell you anything. But this whole lecture should be the secret.
Hello, Dr. Belle. How happy I am to have gotten off the plane just a couple of days ago from the States. and I'm sure you're aware of what's going on in the States today with the occupiers. The situation there, I think, has gotten very, very muddled. And I'm happy to be here today to hear you speak, because you're given a perspective of something which I don't think exists in the United States today. You speak of the labor movement, you speak of the workers, you speak of middle class, and yet in the States today, middle class is workers, are workers middle class? Are labor people workers? It's gotten so muddled that you mentioned about a leader. There's no leader with the occupiers. They know that there's something wrong. And I'm just wondering, would you be able to compare what went on in 1937 to what's going on now? Or is it a different perspective? Or have you, given it much thought? But it is a very critical situation that's going on in the United States. And I fear that what may have started out to be a struggle for the people, for the working class, is going to be smoothed over, and they're going to be made to think, well, we're all middle class, and we're all here because we have a dream, and the whole idea will be devastated or buried.
Out of error cometh truth.
Beg pardon?
Out of error cometh truth.
Absolutely.
You're committing errors in that movement right now. But that goes back to the question that was raised earlier, where do we go to next? And the point that you're making, we are living, when James said free creative activity as necessity, when he threw that weapon at all the structures of the Industrial Revolution and the Industrial Age, he was saying the whole thing should be flattened out. And he was saying that 40 years before we were getting the kinds of organization that we're seeing today. Right. You're talking about a flat organization, because people can communicate with each other in ways that before it would be hierarchical. Mm-hmm. So we are now living in a moment of the transition to new forms of struggle, organization, and everything. So remember what I said, the categories are transitory. They will wither away and then move into another form, and it's just like a spiral. You will see something looking similar, so the insurrection comes around. I could use classical theoretical analysis in terms of my discipline and predict all the stages in North Africa in terms of the insurrection there. Okay, so I could tell you that you start with the protests, you get the response from the regime, the protests get bigger, the killings get more, the people that are getting killed start to defend themselves, you get civil war, the civil war turns into dual power, then you get a struggle between the dual power, and then the regime is overthrown.
That's just where we are
depending on who is in charge at that moment will depend on whether you go to revolutionary change. But it's something that people do in comparative politics all the time. Whether you're talking about the American Revolution, or the Russian Revolution, or the Chinese Revolution, you see the same features. What you didn't see was the BlackBerry.
Dr. Belle, another round of applause for. I was going to tease by thanking the organizers for having Dr. Belle start off the lecture series, because I always say that philosophy should in fact precede the telling of stories. And in fact, we heard him say that to Trevor. So I suspect that Dr. Belle's approach was deliberate, because he was aware that he'd be followed by a series of historians. So to put the historians on track, before they begin to tell their individual stories in the contemplation of individual things and forgetting the connection between things, Dr. Belle had to remind them that in telling their individual stories, that there's a wider connection between the local, the global, and other regional movements before you can discuss and describe the Barbadian 1937 riot. So I think we've had an excellent start to the lecture series. Our evening is not yet complete because we have drinks and some eats, I think, at the back, so we can continue the discussion. Thank you very much for coming.